welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan.
Ryan, happy 50th episode.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. So we've been faithfully showing up for less than 50 months, because we started doing 2 a month a while ago, but it feels really good to feel this pay off a little bit and accumulate a body of podcasts that hopefully is providing a lot of value to our listeners.
Yeah, and speaking of our listeners, we wanted to do another listener Q&A as a part of this episode. So for the last couple of months, we've been asking you to send in questions via email, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and your questions, as always, were a mix of insightful and practical and really got us thinking. So, Ryan, I'm going to start you off with a softball question, and then we'll go from there. Sound good?
Sounds good. Pitch it.
All right. Our first question comes from Twitter, from a user, and hopefully I'm getting this right, but forgive me if I don't. But I'm thinking probably it's Jan Orgen. And the question is, which one do you recommend for a family of 3, youngest being 2 years? And here he's asking about shelters. So really, which shelter do you recommend for a family of 3 with the youngest being 2 years old? And he's using it in a Scandinavian mountain range, summer and autumn.
So summer and autumn in Scandinavia is not like it is here in the Rockies. So it's a little bit damp. It's fairly exposed area. There's a lot of landscape above the tree line up there, and so they're subject to winds. And so I would pick something that's wind resistant, rain resistant, and can ventilate well. And for a family of 3, I think you're not getting extreme conditions weather up there. So my pick would be something like Hyperlight Mountain Gear Ultimate 4, probably with the inner nest with it because of the bugs. There will be pretty outrageous bugs in Scandinavia, at least until July, maybe into August, depending on the year. And I would want some kind of mosquito mesh or some kind of inner tent to keep the bugs at bay. The big mesh inner of the Hyperlight effectively makes it a double wall tent, which is kind of nice for condensation management, so that any condensation that is accumulated on the inside of the fly is dripping onto the mesh and then just kind of rolling down. It's not soaking all your gear in there. Instead of a pyramid, if I were to go with a conventional tent, I would probably opt for something like an ultralight double wall tent that has nice steep walls. Something like the Big Agnes, Copper Spur, or Tiger Wall, or similar. How about you? What would you use in this situation where you've got some exposure to weather, wind and rain, and a requirement for bugs?
I probably would have also gone with the pyramid style shelter. I don't actually own a pyramid style shelter, but I've really got my eyes on them for all of the reasons that you just listed.
They're so versatile.
Yeah. Our next question, we're going all the way across the world from Scandinavia to Papua New Guinea. So this question came in via email. It's from Nicola. And the question is, I'm an academic advisor to schools in Papua New Guinea. I need to adapt some gear choices to the tropical environment. This is a fascinating question.
This is so far out of my wheelhouse, I don't even know what to say. The closest thing I've hiked to a tropical environment is maybe November on the Wonderland Trail, or November, December, January in Olympic National Forest, Olympic National Park. So really humid, soaking wet, just terrible conditions. The difference is it was cold then, and here he's looking for warm conditions. Now I imagine you've probably got more experience hiking in warm, humid conditions in the Southeast than I do in the Northwest.
Yeah, my strategy has been to essentially abandon the idea that there's any way to keep yourself from getting wet. Like my strategy is to lean into it a little bit. So I have gravitated towards hiking sandals. That's the application that I find they really excel at. I know a lot of people that essentially hike in some version of a bathing suit so that they're comfortable when their clothes are just soaking wet, and that they dry quickly whenever it is possible to get them dry.
One thing I was thinking about when this question came up was, you're in the tropics. There's undoubtedly insects and other animals, arachnids perhaps, that are, a little bit more aggressive than they are out here. And so I would definitely want something that would keep me protected and fully enclosed. And so a mesh shelter comes immediately to mind. Something like a mesh tent with a big airy tarp for lots of ventilation, covering it to protect you from the rain because it's a rainy environment. And then I was thinking about the sleeping system. So, if you're looking at overnight lows that are high, maybe they're in the 60s or 70s or 80s even, then you want as much kind of ventilation around your body as you sleep as well, so you can sleep comfortable. And so I think something like a silk liner to sleep in instead of an insulated sleeping bag might be on the gear list. The other thing I was thinking about was the pad. There was a pad made by Pacific Outdoor Equipment, which was a company out of Bozeman, a decade and a half ago. And it was a tropical sleeping mat. And it was basically, there's no insulation to it, but it had width, and it was basically made of a 3D mesh that was resistant to compression. So you got complete airflow under it. It was a fantastic product. I used it when my son was going to summer camps up in Montana, and we had some really hot nights, 70s, and laying the mat on the wood tent platform made for a much better night's sleep than sleeping on a foam pad or an insulated pad.
That's fascinating. Now, this might also, it may be a little stereotypical, but this is probably also a good application for hammock camping as well. It solves a lot of problems at once. You get airflow underneath you, you get up off the ground, you get an integrated bug net. I might go hammock on this.
Yeah, that's a good call too. I have a friend of mine who went to Papua New Guinea for a medical missions trip. And so one of the things he had on his gear list was a machete, which I found was really fascinating. I said, well, aren't there trails? And he said, yeah, there are trails, but the stuff there grows, the vegetation grows so fast that within a matter of weeks, if the trail hasn't been used, it's overgrown and you need a machete to get through. It's interesting. Okay, next question comes from Trace Goes Outside. I think this came in via Instagram, and he asks, what is your outlook on the trade-offs of keeping a full 3-season kit always packed? So we have this philosophy that we've discussed before called 24. And it's basically the idea that you can have a micro adventure in 24 hours door to door. And I've done several of these. They're a core part of what I like to do and how I like to enjoy the backcountry. And one of my tips and tricks for making this manageable is to keep a backpack always packed and ready to go. So Trace is asking, what are the trade-offs of doing that? Well, the big one is what you put in that pack, if you're really going to commit to this philosophy, is what you're going to take on the trip when the time comes. So I kind of make it a personal rule. I'm not going to swap stuff out. I'm going to take what I can, put in my pack, have it ready, and then I'm going to commit to that and be okay with that, because that's kind of the whole philosophical concept for me, is making the barrier to go backpacking as minimal as possible. And I don't want to fiddle around or think about or spend energy on gear choices. So that's the benefit. The trade-off is you have to commit to what's in that kit. The other trade-off is you may have duplicate items that you need to own in order to maintain a pack that's ready to go for backpacking. I have a lot of gear that I use for backpacking and day hiking and pack rafting and biking and, all sorts of different overnight and done in a day activities. But if I'm going to keep an overnight pack packed and ready to go, I've got to have a few duplicates. So that to me is one of the other trade-offs.
Yeah, absolutely. I do a lot of trail running, and a lot of the clothing that I wear and my headlamp, that stuff stays out of my gear closet at all times because I have that with me on long trail runs. So that's definitely a problem. What do you do about storing your insulation? Surely you don't have that compressed in your pack at all times, right?
No. And one way around this, there's two ways around this. One is you keep everything in a large, like, sleeping bag stuff sack. And then when it comes time, you just grab the stuff out of there and pack it into the pack. The other option is to keep it loosely packed in your backpack ready to go. And then when it's time to hit the road, you can compress it down and roll the top of the pack shut and things like that. So my 24 pack is a roll top pack. I tend to keep things very fluffed up and not compressed until I'm ready to leave. I'll compress everything down, add my food, pack up, and go.
Our next question also came from Instagram. This is from John Muse, and he asks, can you speak to any offsetting fuel efficiency gains of using an anodized aluminum pot versus titanium? Ryan, this is a question that's right up your alley.
We have studied this so much. This is a very difficult question to answer. And the reason is because there are different levels of conductivity between titanium and aluminum. The second is that if you look at the thin-walled titanium cookware that's out there and the equivalent weight of aluminum cookware, the aluminum walls are much thicker, so there's more metal. So doing an apples-to-apples comparison is very challenging. If you had a material that had the same mass of metal, aluminum and titanium, the benefit is not going to be realized until you look at very large pots and very large water volumes. Otherwise, the differences are, within the standard measurement of error for most people. And so we're looking at, 5, 10, 15% on mid-sized pots, much less than that on the tiny solo pots that a lot of us use, and a little bit more than that on the bigger pots. In terms of fuel efficiency, aluminum is a better conductor of heat than titanium. And so if you were to do an apples to apples comparison, you'd lean towards aluminum, but titanium is lighter for the same strength. And so you've got weight savings in the pot there as well. And you've got this benefit of having an inert metal, which there's some arguments that it's safer and healthier for you to cook out of.
This next question, I'm also just going to toss straight to you. Hikin' Jim asks, what's a seriously waterproof bivy sack? I have a Mountain Laurel Designs super light, but it's only water resistant.
So the water resistant bivy sacks that have non-waterproof top layers are primarily used with tarps to keep off wind, rain spray, and spin drift. A waterproof bivy sack is needed if you're going to actually use it as your primary shelter exposed to rain. Mountain Laurel Designs makes a waterproof bivy. I can't remember the name of it. It's made of event, 3-layer event. The seams are sealed. It has a top flap that folds over the main body of the bivy a little bit. So you've got a pseudo waterproof seal there, but it's not truly a waterproof seal. It's more like an errant shingle that actually does allow water to come inside. And a lot of these envelope style bivy sacks are built this way. So I don't consider those to be like full on rowdy conditions, waterproof bivvies. I think you have to go to a bivvy that has a sealable, with a waterproof zipper, a sealable window or door. And the better ones have at least one hoop and sometimes 2 hoops in the body to keep that fabric up off your face and to some extent off the chest area of your body, so that there's enough air circulation inside that you can unzip a little bit, still have a little bit of an awning, and allow some of your moisture to escape so you don't drown in condensation. So if you're looking at a bivy sack for big weather, heavy rain, look for something that has at least one pole above your head and an awning that you can unzip the zipper so you can let some ventilation out, and a waterproof, fully sealable waterproof zipper. Anything else is just going to allow moisture into it. Okay, next question comes from TB Lore 927. And he asks, or they ask, any thoughts on Southern Light backpacks out of New Zealand? Andrew?
These guys have been popping up on my Instagram feed in the last year. And over the winter, one of their packs really caught my attention. I looked them up right before we taped this episode, and it seems like he has a a framed pack and an ultralight unframed pack, and then there's a lot of variation that can happen in terms of custom stuff depending on what the customer wants. But the pack I looked at had a lot of storage for gear like snowshoes and a shovel, and it just looked like a very nice, tight, compact package with all that extra gear. So yeah, I'm interested in them.
I am too. I looked at that winter pack as well. I like the idea of a winter pack that has some intentional storage systems built in for some of these bulky items. So many ultralight backpacks, these things are an afterthought and you have to jerry rig it, and it doesn't always work well. I mostly find myself carrying my snowshoes cinched under the top strap of a roll top ultralight pack, but I don't like how they carry up there, because if I'm not snowshoeing and I'm bushwhacking, which I tend to do more in the winter of than in the summer, that's this wide thing that's sitting out there and banging your head and catching on trees and whatnot. So I really like my snowshoes strapped to the back of the daisy chains on the back of the pack. And so I liked how their system was set up as well.
All right, worth a look. Maybe we'll get a review of them sometime this year. User Pinus Longjava, I'm guessing, asks about the environmental impact of switching to a backcountry bidet.
I'm going to assume they are concerned about the fact that you are putting contaminated water into the ground. And so I think the impact is incredibly minimal. The same leave no trace principles apply. You need to go to the bathroom 200 feet from the nearest water source. You need to make sure you are digging down into the mineral soil in order to deposit your waste. You need to pack out your toilet paper. I mean, that's like the rule of the new West, is we got to pack out our toilet paper now because we can't burn it anymore. The wildfire risk is too high. And there's so many people visiting the backcountry, especially in the popular areas, that burying toilet paper and then having animals dig it up is an unsightly mess. And it does take some time to break down. So the advantage to the backcountry bidet is twofold in my eyes. And I use a bidet method, so I can testify to this. The first is health. The ability to stay clean with a bidet method is miles beyond the ability to stay clean using toilet paper. And so I like that, especially when it comes to managing infections and hemorrhoids and all these kinds of things. The bidet method is fantastic if you do it right. The second advantage is you use no toilet paper, so there's nothing to pack out. Now, I bring some, and I bring some to dry before I'm done, because especially if I'm like hiking right away again, then that helps eliminate chafing. So I'll bring a little bit and I'll pack that out. So those are the two big advantages I see to the bidet that has a positive impact on your experience and on the environment.
All right, the next question is from For Love of Wilderness. And they ask, what do you think about a shelter for 2 kids and 2 adults? And this listener has 2 1.5-year-old twins. So more power to you for taking them camping. That's amazing. He has a Kufu DCF with a half inner, and he's wondering if he should get the full inner and a 2-person tent with 2 vestibules.
It's a little bit confusing to me, but I'm guessing that he has this existing tent. He wants to add as little as possible to make sure he has enough for his family. I assume there will be 1 adult in the Kufu with 1 child and 1 adult in the other tent with 1 child. I would bite the bullet and get 1 tent for all of you. And here's why. 1, being together in a single space as a family is a joyful memory to treasure. And there's going to be some hard times, but that memory of just everyone being in the same shelter is a real treat to hold on to. Second is that when drama hits in the middle of the night, and drama squared will hit with twins, it's nice to have your partner help you and be right there to help you. So I would go with a tent that's probably with 2 young twins that age. I would say, a 3-person tent should be sufficient. And something like the Nemo Dagger 3P would be a fantastic family tent. It's got steep walls. There's plenty of room for 2 adults and 2 small kids, and 2 big vestibules, and lots of options to spread out and arrange your gear and get organized and have a great time with the kids. Okay, the next question comes from Matt from Twitter. And he says, why are long and wide sleeping pads and large sleeping bags so common, but shelters that can comfortably hold a 6 to 6.5 foot person so much harder to find? Andrew, this is a tough one for us. We're I'm 5'7". How tall are you? 5'6"?
I'm 5'6". Yeah, I'm travel sized. This is just a guess based on studying the market for the last few years, but I think the answer to the question of why is that everybody, no matter how tall or short you are, can feel comfortable on a wide pad or feel like they have more room in a large bag. Whereas for me, being 5'6", a shelter that's designed for someone who's 6'5", that just feels like wasted space to me. I don't need that much extra headroom or foot room to feel comfortable in a 1 or 2 man shelter. So that's going to be my guess, is that the market for wide sleeping pads is just way bigger than the market for people who are 6'6". That's just my guess. I'd be interested in any thoughts you have, Ryan, and then also maybe your suggestion for a tall user.
I think it comes down to what the market wants. And unfortunately, we are a consumer society that has a thirst for competitive specifications, which means we'll look at a table of shelters and we'll immediately be drawn to the lightest shelter and spend more time looking at that than we will looking at a shelter that's heavier. That's our first response. Now, as consumers, as we shop and dive in, we'll learn the nuances of these shelters and maybe select something else. But those are the most attractive ones, so the ones that have the minimum weight in that column. So as a manufacturer, I'm going to want to build a shelter that allows me to win that race towards lightness so that I can get more eyeballs on my shelter, even though I may not sell that shelter to all of those eyeballs. So I think there's a specifications race involved here. That's probably my biggest driver in answering this question. In terms of a suggestion for a tall user, pyramid shelters are difficult because you've got a pole in the middle and then sloping walls. And the problem with single pole trekking pole shelters and single pole pyramids, and with trekking pole shelters that are pitched with 2 trekking poles in the middle of, where the apex is that there's minimal headroom at either end. And this is exacerbated for tall people. So I would look for a shelter that has a higher head end and some kind of support at the foot end. There's several models out there like this, but designs to stay away from would be single hoop tunnel tents and trekking pole tents that are pitched with 2 trekking poles right in the middle of the shelter. One of the ones I like for tall people that has worked pretty well because it's asymmetrical is the Durston X Mid series and the Tarp tent Stratospire. So both of these tents have some volume at the head and foot because of their asymmetry, and the Tarp tent has these volumizing pitch lock corners that raise the edges up a little bit. And so those to me would be 2 places that are potential starting points. Okay. Yoon Piano Tech via Instagram asks, do you talk with trees and flowers on the trail? Do you hug trees to share some love? Andrew, you're softer. You have a softer heart than I do, so I'm going to let you answer this first, and then I'll jump in.
I do not talk to trees. I do not hug trees. I do talk to myself quite a bit when I'm solo hiking, and I also talk to my gear a lot when it fails or breaks. How
you,
about you?
you really need to talk to your gear when it's working for you, because it's good karma. Yeah, I have found myself as I've gotten older to appreciate nature more, and especially to appreciate the quiet, intimate moments with nature, and being able to notice trees, flowers, birds, grasses, whatever, pine cones even, and the beauty that's inherent in all this kind of stuff is something that I didn't have in my 20s, but I have a much, much deeper appreciation for it now.
Okay, well, Robert via email wants to learn how to apply the ultralight philosophy to Boundary Waters canoe area canoe trips. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've done some canoe tripping, and I think there is no reason why an ultralight backpacking kit cannot be used almost verbatim on a canoe trip. And especially up in Quetico and Boundary Waters, you're looking at a significant amount of portaging. So you are carrying your canoe and or your gear, and sometimes you're doing laps with it. The classic canoe tripper will drop their pack, untie it from their canoe, carry their canoe across a portage, and then come back and carry their pack across the portage. And then if they're really carrying a lot of gear, they'll come back and carry their second pack or duffel or whatever they're taking across the portage. And so some of these guys are doing 2 to 3 trips. One of the beautiful things about lightweight backpacking philosophy on a canoe trip is that if you stick to ultralight ideals, you can take your canoe and your pack in one trip, and it's not quite so painful. And so I would say there's so much similarity between the two. Really, the only difference is in the mode of travel. I have found that I will change out the shoes I wear. I will take a shoe that drains better on a canoe trip, and I will typically take a different style of fishing gear, because I'm not stream fishing, I'm lake fishing, so I might bring a spinning rod or something like that. So those are the main differences, but it's absolutely applicable to canoe tripping. And in fact, we've seen more and more discussion in our forums about canoe and wilderness raft trips and things like this, where you're not walking necessarily, but you're applying all the same principles to save weight, save volume, and just make managing all your gear a little bit easier.
Yeah, I think the biggest struggle might be battling the psychological urge to fill up empty space in your canoe with stuff,
especially a cooler.
Yeah. Or I mean, it kind of makes me think of the article that Rex Sanders wrote for us about battling that urge by intentionally buying a small pack. Yeah. And I think that with the canoe, you're dealing with the urge to pack it full of stuff because it's got a lot of space.
Yeah, and it really does come down to style. A lot of canoe trippers will take a cooler so they can have fresh food with them. I understand that. It's a popular thing in the Grand Canyon on big raft trips down there too. It just depends on your style and how fast you want to go and how much effort you want to put into managing all your gear. So the next question is from Nabil. This is via email. And he says, I backpacked on and off all my life. I'm now 64. About 10 years ago, I was introduced to ultralight. In the coming year, I hope to drop a couple of pounds in base weight. I expect most of this from transitioning from a tent and sleeping bag to a tarp and a quilt. Andrew, how can he make this transition as easy as possible?
Well, I would just start off by saying that it's possible to drop a significant amount of weight and go quote unquote ultralight and still use a fully enclosed shelter and a bag if that's the style of backpacking that he's comfortable with. You and I have both, I know for a fact, gone on ultralight trips where we've used fully enclosed shelters and sleeping bags. So you can find the gear that will allow you to drop ounces and maybe pounds and still have those things, or one or the other, or go to quilts and tarp and then add weight back in if you find a luxury item that makes you happy. I guess the thing I'm trying to say is that ultralight isn't a set formula of now I've got a tarp, now I've got a quilt, now I've got a frameless pack. It's more about a mindset.
Absolutely. I did some hiking in Yellowstone in the winter with a tarp, And I opted to bring a 20 degree below zero rated Gore-Tex full zip mummy hooded sleeping bag. So that with a tarp was actually not so bad, because I could hole up in this mummy bag and, you know, have a little breathing hole out there and be nice and toasty on some really horrendously cold nights. Now, this is not a blizzard conditions shelter by any means in the Yellowstone winter. So the flip side of that is, okay, I've got an ultralight tent, or maybe even a bomber tent, you know, something like a mountaineering tent, and a quilt, because the quilt is ultimately just more comfortable for me to sleep in because I'm not sitting so confined. Now I've got a bomber tent that gives me protection from snow loading or wind or big storms or whatever, but I can have the comfort of an ultralight quilt and enjoy the benefits of that. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of things in between that allow us to kind of tweak the system. So I would agree with you. You can go just a lighter tent, a lighter sleeping bag, or you can mix and match tarps and quilts and pyramids and all these kinds of things to make a system that works for you in the conditions where you're hiking.
All right, Bob from Australia says, I've been a bushwalker all my life through Boy Scouts, hunting and fishing, and 27 years of active duty in the Army. I always went as light as I could, but never weighed my pack. I didn't want to know. But I'm at 58 years old with numerous injuries, and I just can't carry what I once did. So a good friend introduced me to lightweight and ultralight backpacking.
We see this a lot. Being forced to lighten up. Do you feel like this is the normal course of a lightweight hiker's journey? Because we hear these stories over and over again. Or are we able to accomplish something by starting this journey earlier?
I think there's two things that immediately jump out to me. One is that from a purely practical, logistical standpoint, I think there's a lot of value to be had in going ultralight over a period of years as early as you can, because ultralight gear can be expensive. And suddenly getting into your 50s or 60s and realizing you have to change your entire kit can be very overwhelming from a price standpoint and also from a skills standpoint, because a lot of ultralight gear requires the gradual gaining of a certain knowledge set. So the earlier you start that process, the better. And then the second thing is, I always think about that line from Raiders of the Lost Ark when Miriam tells Indiana Jones, "You're not the man I knew 10 years ago." And he says, "It ain't the years, honey, it's the mileage."
Yep.
I say it to my wife all the time. Carrying less weight now will have a drastic cumulative effect on your body later on in your life.
That is the biggest thing I keep telling people is you can carry a 50 or 60 or 70 pound pack today, but you're pulling from your health bank later on, and your risk of injury will go up, and we're not perfectly resilient human beings for sure. Well, I just want to interject here and say that if you are an unlimited member, you have access to the video version of this podcast. And if you're watching my face get dark because there's clouds covering the sky and I'm in front of a window here. So I'm going to take a break and give you a jarring change as I change my camera settings. I'll be right back. Okay, that should be much better. Hello, everybody. And on to the next question. Miguel from Vancouver sent me an email and asks, setting up shelters or camps in unruly weather. Now, Miguel is from Vancouver, and this is Vancouver, British Columbia, and it is a historically rainy environment, and in many of the mountains around that region, it's also very stormy and windy. So I bet he has encountered the need to set up a shelter in windy and rainy weather. So Andrew, do you have any advice for him?
I do. Well, having also grown up in a temperate rainforest, just like Vancouver is, I can say that this is where having a single wall shelter or a double wall shelter that allows you to set up the fly before the interior mesh is very helpful. And then the second thing I would say is that this is where the development of skill and practice comes into play, because you do not want to be trying to puzzle over your shelter when the wind is blowing and you're getting rained on. So practice is key here. What do you think?
When we are on group trips in environments like this, we'll take a large tarp with us. And sometimes just being able to get a big tarp set up right when we get into camp so that everybody can get their gear under there and get dry or get out of the rain at least, has such a huge impact on morale. And that alone can create some energy reserve that then when you're ready, it will allow you to attack the storm and set up your camp more methodically and more intentionally after you've had that break. Because sometimes when I get into camp and the conditions are unruly, I panic a little bit and I start making mistakes. And I really find that I want to get into camp and just breathe for a little bit. And I'll even do this solo. I won't bring a tarp, but I will find, a big spruce tree to rest under for 5 minutes, grab a snack and a drink, just so I can recover my wits. And then I can focus all my energy into setting up camp. And there's not this panic transition.
Yeah. I've even done the tarp thing just with me and one other hiking partner, and it's totally worth it. Totally worth it. All right. Our last question comes from James, and I think this is a good one to end on. James says, I have mostly backpacked with experienced people. I'm interested in using backpackinglight.com to gain more knowledge for myself and not have to depend on other people. And we should say here that James is 70, so he's interested in getting some of these solo trips in before he gets much older. And in order to do that, he wants to get his pack weight down as much as possible without being unsafe or uncomfortable. So he wraps up by asking, any suggestions or recommendations will be appreciated.
My two pieces of feedback for James are, don't stop hiking with experienced people. You will continue to enjoy the fruits of knowledge from them, and that will help you gain more confidence. The second thing is, how do you gain competence for solo hiking? And my answer there is, start as small as you feel comfortable with. Maybe that's an overnighter in your backyard. Maybe it's in a state park. Maybe it's in a nearby national forest on an easy trail. So start where the factor of safety is buffered in your favor so that you're not taking unnecessary risks. And then eventually you increase the distance and the number of nights and the decrease the weight of your pack as you go, so that you become really comfortable with your gear in those conditions for the amount of time you're out. Second, he noted to me that he hikes mainly in the high Sierra. And so in terms of staying safe and comfortable, a lot of access to the high Sierra requires some fairly long approaches. So again, I would say maybe if you want to get to the alpine environment and experiment, stay close to trailheads that are high in elevation. So there's several trailheads in the Sierra that are between 9,000 and 10,000 feet that allow you to get to the tree line in 1 to 2 days. And I would say go for those areas before trying to do, a 3-day approach into the mountains for your first time out on a solo trip.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for sending in your questions, and thank you for listening over the last 50 episodes. We hope to continue being able to provide you with a useful resource to continue growing your skills and get out there with safety and enjoyment.
In our next segment, we are going to interview one of Backpacking Light's diversity grant recipients. We created this grant program in 2020 in response to a need in the outdoor industry to foster a more diverse outdoor environment. Our first interview today is going to be with Narinda Heng, and Narinda received a grant to hike the Tahoe Rim Trail with her partner. That hike was canceled. We'll talk a little bit about that because of wildfires. And she has something else in the works, and we'll talk about that as well. And I hope you get to know Narinda through this short interview.
All right, Narinda, welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
I live in Oakland, Ohlone Lands, and I've lived here for about 7.5 years. That's the sound of the cat. I don't know if you heard. I've been a backpacking and climbing instructor for the last 5 years, and I think climbing is my primary passion, and then backpacking is something that I was able to get into after sort of getting more outdoor experiences via climbing.
Okay. So what are your goals with regards to the outdoors? Like what gets you up in the morning and what gets you out there? You know, what motivates you when things get hard out there? Just tell us a little bit about your thought process.
I think my goals lately have been to figure out how to get out there with sort of the lightest footprint possible. It's pretty challenging, I think, thinking a lot about driving fossil fuel driven cars and gas and high-tech fabrics and materials. I think continuing to just figure out how to, well, maybe it's like to resist sort of the urge sometimes to like upgrade gear. And I think for me right now, my goal is just to like make sure that I'm staying healthy, getting my daily stretching in, and just making sure that I can do this for a good long time without having to have too many body parts replaced or reinforced. Yeah. I'm in my 30s, so there's that.
Yeah, me too. So I hear you. Yeah. I'm interested to dig in a little more there. What are some of the practical things you're doing to sort of approach the outdoors from a mindful place, ecologically speaking? You mentioned not upgrading your gear, but I'm wondering if you have any other strategies.
I think figuring out fuels, learning to use alcohol stoves because they don't require, I can buy that liquid fuels in bulk rather than having pressurized canisters. That's still a challenge just because, well, for one, alcohol stoves are not practical for use everywhere. In California, it's actually pretty hard to get denatured alcohol.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think trying to use fewer like single meal packed foods, trying to figure out how to have sort of a mixture between bulk meals and pre-planned meals. I am making a foray into figuring out how I can use my car less or to carpool more. I mean, those are just really basic things. I'm not a particularly competent cyclist, but I feel like bikepacking, and I know that Backpacking Lot has covered some bikepacking before, and I'd love to learn more about that. Yeah, mainly it's a mindset right now. I don't know that I have like a ton of practical things aside from learning different fuels, carrying a little bit heavier gear sometimes, and just using my gear as long as I possibly can.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely an evolving subject. We're kind of all doing the best we can, you know, as things come up and new information comes to light. What's the most fun or most wild or most crazy adventure you've had in the last few years? What stands out?
Something that comes to mind is definitely having to do, well, climbing with a friend, and it was a multi-pitch climb, a few hundred feet, and during this climb, they injured their ankle, and we decided to still climb to the very top. Like climbing, multi-pitch climbing is, you know, like extra vertical hiking in a way. And we got to the top, and then having to make this scrambly journey down in the dark because it took us a really long time to get up, and then it also took us a really long time to get down, and their ankle was hurting quite a bit. And at the end of this long, slow scramble where, you know, I had to do a little bit of shuttling of our gear. I had to go find the car. We got to the car, and then we went to eat pho instead of going directly to a hospital because, I don't know, that was our assessment of what was needed at that moment. It was really hydrating. That's that's kind of the most sort of like epic-ish experience. But as far as with backpacking, I think spending time 19 days on trail. I've never spent that long on trail in a situation that wasn't for work. I've worked, 14, 24. I was an intern on a 28-day trip, only in the context of work. And last year, because of so many different factors, I was on trail for 19 days and on the Numupoyo, also known as the Jamir Trail, and going through that terrain, and especially Forester Pass was one of my very favorite passes, and I can't wait to hike over in that area again. I think being out and standing and looking out into this terrain, knowing that I'm not the first nor the last person to ever have been there, and to take in how vast the world is, and just to be a part of that landscape, to take those alpine lake dips. I kind of live for those. And that is the reason I will carry a pack for many miles, is those waters.
Absolutely.
And those dips.
I think that's a good transition into my next question, which is to talk to you about your art and your poetry. You're a writer and an artist. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've been writing for a long time. It was kind of the primary format of self-expression that I took on from a pretty young age. And before I think I had gone on one car camping trip until I started climbing at 27. So poetry and community events involving poetry, art, writing, drama, music were sort of like kind of my entire how I spent time. And when I came into climbing and backpacking, and especially when I went into instructing, of course, because those are the experiences that I was having, that makes its way into my writing. A lot of my writing has been about what it's like to be a person of color who goes outside, to be a queer person of color who goes outside, to be a person who has a little bit of a different history than sort of like the typical narrative of like, oh, I've been outside all my life, or I went to summer camps, or I went on these backpacking trips as a kid, or as a teenager, I went on an Outward Bound or Knowles course. And that sort of, I guess that influences, maybe my poetry is not always about that, but it's also about the experience of like going out there and my writing is about going out there and not necessarily feeling like it's an escape so much as sort of a relief. I think it's a subtle difference in that escape makes it sound like it's something that I can get away from, whereas a relief kind of is like knowing that all these things that are happening in the world and all these things that are part of my experience and my history and many other people's experiences and histories of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, classism, so many of the things, they are a little easier to hold, and it kind of gets me back in touch with sort of the more than human world, away from the built environment, and reminds me that the experience of, being out in a certain landscape, being exposed to the air, to the weather, and to other animals, to insects, that these are experiences that I have in common with so many people who have been there before me. It makes me feel more connected. And I think that comes through in writing. I think a lot of my writing is also about encouraging folks who may not see themselves in these landscapes or in maybe typical media representation, that that it's okay not to be, and that we can find ways to connect with one another and bring one another out. And that's on the writing side of things. As far as I'm also a potter. That actually came into my life the same time that becoming a backpacking and climbing instructor did. And I realized that there are ways that just because the input that I'm getting from landscapes, even if I'm not intentionally trying to make a piece of pottery that is, like the red cliffs of Indian Creek, Utah, where I just spent some time, I recognize that, that aesthetic has definitely come through. The aesthetic of like lichen on redwoods has definitely come through, or more so lichen on cedars, or the like the bright granite, the colors of the bright granite and the textures of rocks and cliffs have come through. I'm trying to find, like this is a cup that I made recently that just makes me think of being in the Sierra. So it's my morning little coffee cup.
Yeah.
For a while now.
We'll if you could send us maybe some photos, we'd love to put them up on the screen so people can take a look at them some of your ceramics. And
thank you.
And then also, where can people find you online if they want to look at more of your work?
I am on longcoolhallway.com, just those 3 words spelled out. Mm-hmm. That's my website. And if they use Instagram, it's at Narinda, Narinda with 3 underscores.
Great. Okay, we'll put links to all that in the show notes.
Thank you.
What's a piece of outdoor-related advice that you wish someone had given you earlier in your life, or that you learned earlier in your life?
Been thinking about this one quite a bit and trying to figure that out.
Or maybe we could frame it this way. What's a piece of advice that you would give someone that you feel would be very helpful to someone who is just beginning, to you 5 years ago?
Something that was on my mind a lot after last year's Numupoyo hike is that it's okay to go slow. It's not about how fast you hike. And it's not about, like, you don't have to do it in any particular way. I think whichever way feels good, and it can be really nice to spend just a lot of time on trail, even if you're not walking, 20 miles in a day, even if it's, 4 miles or 10 miles. If you spend that, that you don't have to go a particular speed in order to be, a real hiker. And something I didn't realize until I'd been spending a lot of time outdoors and teaching folks some of these skills, is that, like, my family's been cooking outside and hanging out outdoors, like in parks or in the backyard for so long, all my life. And really remembering that. So go slow, eat good food.
I love that. Well, what's next on your plate? What's the next adventure you've got coming up?
Well, in the potentially near future, I'm going to go to Yosemite Valley in the winter. Well, not the winter. Is November? Mid-November is not winter yet. It's still fall. I'm going to go and see if I can manage any climbing in what looks to be 45-degree Yosemite Valley. I haven't spent much time there, and it was brought to my attention recently that it's a travesty to live 4 hours away from the valley and not spend much time there as a climber. And sort of a little bit beyond that is I'm sorting out, hopefully sorting out a way to get on the big Seki loop, which actually I learned about via a backpacking light post, but it's a big Sequoia Kings Canyon loop that's 158 miles, but it begins and ends at Road's End. So it's I love loops, and it it shares the trail with the JMT PCT route. So I'm going to keep researching with my friend Andrea to figure out a time for that to happen.
Wonderful. Well, good luck to you in all of your adventures. Thank you for talking to us and sharing your insight with us. Really appreciate your artistic way of looking at the world. It really means a lot. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
All right. Happy trails.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, well, we're going to wrap up the show today by talking a little bit about what's new at BPL. So, Ryan, you and I have been working on updating the Ultralight Backpacking Boot Camp. What's new with that?
So the boot camp is our signature online course that is designed to introduce people to the world of ultralight backpacking. And the first area we tackled, we really felt that it should be footwear. So we've canned the old footwear modules, and we've created an entire new course series on minimalist footwear. And we did this because this is probably the single piece of gear that is universally adopted by more people practicing ultralight hiking than any other piece of gear. That's not to say that there aren't ultralight hikers with light packs wearing midweight or even heavyweight boots. There are, but generally the trail running shoe has become the iconic feature of ultralight backpacking. And there's so much misunderstanding about trail running shoes out there. And so I really wanted to expand this module and provide good, solid foundational education so that people can understand what are the strengths and limitations of minimalist footwear, what types of footwear are available to people, and in what situations do I pick one type of minimalist footwear over another. And so you helped me put that together, and I think the module came out absolutely fantastic. So we're excited to continue updating the boot camp. Right now, we're working on packing systems, shelter systems, and cooking systems. And we're going to continue evolving this to keep it up to date and just keep it really relevant and increase the value of it over time so that we're learning new stuff all the time. And I want to make sure we're putting that into our education programs as well and keeping them up to date.
The other thing we should mention is the Publisher's Gear Guide, which dropped the same day that this episode drops on November 23rd. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what is this gear guide and how is it different from the staff Pics gear guide, which some of our listeners may already be familiar with?
About 10 years ago, I've been getting emails since I started backpacking like 20 years ago, but about 10 years ago, the email load became so high that it became overwhelming for me. So the number one question people ask me is, what gear do you use for X? Or what type of rain jacket or tent or shelter or cooking kit do you recommend today? That drove development of the Publisher's Gear Guide. That way I could send them a link and I could say, this is what I'm using this year, is what I'm recommending right now. Here's the strengths and limitations of this gear in this particular context. So that's the impetus behind the gear guide. The second thing is that I wanted to provide a comprehensive gear guide that covers all product categories. So staff picks is we take and survey all of our staff and say, give us your 3 favorite pieces of gear for the year. And it could be all over the map. Everybody might pick shoes. So maybe we've got 36 shoe entries in there, but that doesn't happen. It's usually pretty diverse. But I wanted to provide a gear guide that was across the board with all gear categories in there. And I pick 1 or 2 or 3 items from each category to give people an idea of, give me a starting point. I'm looking for a rain jacket. I'm going to say, okay, here are the 3 rain jackets I recommend. Here's the one I recommend for this scenario, and this scenario. And that gives them enough breadth of options that then they can go and do their own research. Maybe one of those 3 works for them, maybe it doesn't, but it gives some insight into my gear selection process so that I can help people think about what they should be thinking about when it comes time to pick a piece of gear for the situation they're looking for.
Awesome. Well, can you give us a little sneak peek? Just give us one thing that might be in the guide.
Yeah, I have been a passionate user of pyramid tents for many, many years. And again, we mentioned it earlier in this episode, how versatile the pyramid tent is. My favorite tent continues to be the Locust Gear Kufu. It's a 2-person pyramid. I use it for solo use. The construction quality is impeccable. There's something about Japanese construction that is so precise and meticulous and careful, and the aesthetics are just gorgeous. And that translates to performance. It translates into wind stability, snow shedding stability. And this is one piece of gear where I just think you've got a piece of art that is incredibly functional, very light, and can span all 4 seasons. So that's my favorite pick for the entire gear guide this year.
All right, and the last thing to mention is the Food Planning Members Q&A. This is a series of Q&As that we've been doing for a while now, and what can people expect out of the food planning one?
Our member Q&As, we're offering them once a month right now. They are 1 hour on the money. We are not going to tease people and cut them off at 40 minutes, and we're not going to waste people's times and take them more than an hour. So these are solid 1 hour seminars where we give a short keynote at the beginning. It might last 20 or 30 minutes. Then we'll take a series of questions that have been some collected beforehand. Some will be answered live during the live stream event. And those questions will be focused on the topic we're talking about. So in this next one, we'll be answering questions about planning food for backpacking trips. If there's time, we experimented with this in one of our Q&As. We'll also open it up to general backpacking questions. And so we didn't have time in the last one to do that. We did have time in the one before that. So we'll put a link to the live stream event in the show notes here. And if you get a chance to come on and join us live, you can send questions in and I'll do my best to answer them live. Otherwise, if you can't make that, we are recording them. They are available to members and you'll have access to them indefinitely. So the first one we did in September was about layering systems. In October, we looked at shelter systems. November, we're looking at food planning. And December, we're looking at backcountry electronics. So we've got a nice schedule coming up now on these, and they're a great way to just familiarize yourself with the topic and shoot some off-the-cuff questions to us.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Backpacking Light Podcast. The Backpacking Light Podcast is advertising free, thanks to the membership fees paid by Backpacking Light members. A BackpackingLight.com membership gives you access to 20 years of archives, forums, and online courses. And don't forget, if you're an unlimited member, you'll get the video version of this podcast for free as a part of your membership. So please consider supporting this podcast and become a member right now at BackpackingLight.com/membership.
You can download the show notes for this episode at backpackinglight.com/podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. It does help other people find the show.
Thanks for listening to the Backpacking Light Podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan. And if we can leave you with one parting message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from the car.